All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving into some seriously murky waters.
Mm.
The UK's intelligence picture in the lead-up to the 2003 Iraq War. We've got our hands on sections 41 and 42 of the Report of the Iraq Inquiry, the Chilcot Inquiry.
Heavy stuff.
It is, and it gets right to the heart of what UK intelligence believed about Iraq's WMD program. When they believed it, the whole 9 yards. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Iraq War. WMDs again. Haven't we heard it all? But trust me on this. These documents, they reveal a whole new side to those early assessments, especially around 2000, 2001.
Yeah, the context back then, it was anything but clear-cut.
So no easy answers then.
Not a chance. It wasn't a simple case of yes WMDs or no WMDs. It was more like, imagine trying to piece together a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing, and the ones you do have, well, they might be from a different puzzle altogether.
Talk about a headache. So what were they actually working with? What was the UK's Joint Intelligence Committee, the JIC, saying about Iraq's capabilities back then?
It's interesting, actually. The JIC assessments from those early years, they were surprisingly nuanced.
Nuance in the world of intelligence. Go on.
They acknowledged, and this is key, they acknowledged the possibility that Iraq had stashed away some chemical and biological weapons.
Leftovers from the first Gulf War, that sort of thing?
Exactly. But here's the catch. They couldn't definitively say whether Iraq was actively making more.
Hold on. So they suspected Iraq might have some WMDs tucked away, but they weren't sure if they were actively cooking up more. Why the uncertainty?
Well, you gotta remember who we're dealing with here, Saddam Hussein. He'd played this game before, used chemical weapons, had a knack for hiding his WMD activities, made it a nightmare for intelligence agencies to separate fact from fiction, you know?
Like trying to tell if someone's bluffing in a high-stakes poker game, except the stakes here involve, well, war. You can't exactly call their bluff without the cards to back it up.
Precisely. And to make things even more complicated, the whole international community was still trying to figure out how to deal with Iraq after that first Gulf War. UN resolutions demanding disarmament, inspections, but then also sanctions, hindering their ability to, well, rebuild. It was a recipe for tension, that's for sure.
So we've got this backdrop of uncertainty, a history of deception, and this pressure cooker of international politics, and then boom, 2002 arrives, and with it, the infamous dodgy dossier, as they called it.
Yes, the dossier, the document that was supposed to make the case for action against Iraq, painted as this imminent threat.
And it didn't hold back. The dossier claimed Iraq could have WMDs ready to launch within, get this, 45 minutes. Not just a possibility, but almost a certainty, the way they framed it.
The 45-minute claim. Yeah, that was something else.
So while all this is going on, you've got UN weapons inspectors actually on the ground in Iraq, right?
Right.
Were they finding anything at all to back up these terrifying claims?
That's where things get really interesting. The inspectors, they weren't finding much of anything, which really put the UK government in a tough spot.
You'd think that would have calmed things down a bit, wouldn't you? Seeing as how the inspectors weren't exactly tripping over WMDs left and right?
You'd think so, but it didn't really play out that way. The UK government, especially those pushing for military action, they stuck to their guns. Imagine being a fly on the wall during those meetings. Evidence versus conviction. Facts going head-to-head with, well, gut feelings.
Talk about a pressure
Yeah.
cooker. It's like the narrative, the sheer momentum of it all kind of took on a life of its own. That dossier, it really ramped up the sense of urgency, maybe even overshadowed the need for, rock-solid proof.
Yeah, I'd say you hit the nail on the head. Those subtleties, those uncertainties within the intelligence community, they didn't exactly make it to the front page news, did they?
Not exactly primetime material, I guess.
It was a classic case of intelligence to fit the policy instead of the other way around.
Which brings us to 2003, the invasion. But even after all that, after Saddam's regime is toppled, the hunt for WMDs, it didn't stop there. If anything, it's like they doubled down.
It's almost as if they needed to find those weapons, had to find them to justify everything that had happened.
We're talking mobile labs, conflicting analyses about what they were actually for, and even, eventually, some of the key intel used to justify the whole thing. Well, some of it gets walked back, discredited.
Yeah, and you can't underestimate how crucial that post-invasion period was. When they didn't find those massive stockpiles, the ones they'd been so sure were there, well, people started asking some hard questions. About the intelligence, about the whole decision to go to war in the first place.
So it's like a mirror image of those early assessments, isn't it? Starting from the assumption that Iraq had these weapons and then bending over backward to prove it, even when the evidence wasn't exactly stacking up.
Right. And remember, on top of everything else, you've got the utter chaos of post-invasion Iraq. The security situation was a nightmare. Potential evidence sites destroyed, not to mention the very real possibility of confirmation bias influencing how they interpreted whatever evidence they did find.
It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle after someone's gone and mix up all the pieces, then set the box on fire.
A very chaotic jigsaw puzzle indeed. And it's important to keep in mind, everything we're looking at here, this is from the UK's perspective.
Hmm.
These documents, they mention U.S. intelligence, sure, but they don't go into the nitty-gritty of what the Americans were thinking, what they were seeing.
So we're only getting one side of the story, really.
In a way, yes. It's crucial to remember that while the UK and the US, they shared some intel, assuming they were both on the exact same page, well, that would be a mistake. Each nation, they had their own context, their own priorities. Understanding those nuances, it's essential if we want to grasp the full picture of what happened.
That's a lot to unpack, that's for sure. So after going down this rabbit hole, where do we even land? What's the takeaway from all this, this tangled mess of intelligence, assumptions, and the consequences that followed?
The Iraq inquiry, especially the sections we've been looking at, they offer some pretty stark lessons. I think the biggest one, the one that really jumps out, is the absolute necessity of transparency when it comes to intelligence gathering. And not just transparency, but rigorous analysis, really digging into the details.
So it's not enough to just present the conclusions, you're saying?
Exactly. You got to lay it all out, the limitations, the what-ifs, the maybes. And it's not just on the intelligence community to do that. Policymakers, the ones making those big decisions, they need to acknowledge those limitations, factor them in, really grapple with them.
It's like this balancing act, isn't it? Conveying a sense of urgency when it feels like there's a real threat, but at the same time, making sure that urgency is rooted in rock-solid evidence.
100%. And that's where things get especially tricky, because there's always that risk of politicization, especially when the stakes are this high. The pressure to find the evidence that supports your agenda, your desired outcome.
Yep.
It can lead to confirmation bias, to shutting down dissenting voices, even to just ignoring the uncertainties within the intelligence itself.
And in this case, that lack of concrete evidence, the fact that they never did find those massive WMD stockpiles, that really casts a long shadow, doesn't it, on the whole thing?
Absolutely. It was the missing piece, the one they built the entire justification around. And when it wasn't there, well, it forced everyone to take a long, hard look in the mirror. How was intelligence used? More importantly, how was it misused? The whole thing really underscored the need for independent oversight, accountability, especially when you're talking about matters of war and peace.
It really drives home the point that even with the best intentions, intelligence can be flawed. And those flaws, well, they can have consequences. Real serious consequences.
No doubt about it. The Iraq experience, it's a cautionary tale. It's a reminder to constantly question assumptions, scrutinize the evidence, and most importantly, to have those tough conversations, those open, honest debates, when intelligence is being used to shape those critical decisions. And this isn't ancient history we're talking about here. This is a lesson that's still as relevant as ever.
Something to keep in mind, for
Right.
sure. And on that note, one final thought to leave you with. If Saddam Hussein, as it seems, wasn't actively developing WMDs at the time, why go to all that trouble to convince the world he was? Something to ponder as we sign off for today.